What we're going to do now is an edited short documentary on the Great Depression. Now, the reason why we're doing this is because we want to learn from history, because we're facing a depression that's coming up very soon. The depression we're going to have is going to be something similar but different. So I want to make this very short documentary very interesting. Let's get started right now. The Great Depression, from the years 1929 to 1939, was the deepest and longest lasting economic downturn in the history of the Western industrialized world. In the United States, the Great Depression began soon after the stock market crash of October 1929, which sent Wall Street into a panic and wiped out millions of investors. Over the next several years, consumer spending and investment dropped, causing steep declines in industrial output and rising levels of unemployment. As failing companies laid off workers, by 1933, when the Great Depression reached its climax, some 15 to 13 million Americans were unemployed, and nearly half of the country's banks had failed. Through the relief and reform measures put into place by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt that helped lessen the worsening effects of the Great Depression in the 1930s. The economy would not fully turn around until after 1939, when World War II kicked in, as American industry kicked into high gear. The stock market crash of 1929. The American economy entered an ordinary recession during the summer of 1929. As consumer spending dropped and unsold goods began to pile up, slowing production, at the same time, stock prices continued to rise, and by the fall of that year, had reached levels that could not be justified by anticipated future earnings. On October 24th, 1929, the stock market bubble finally burst, as investors began dumping shares en masse. A recorded 12.9 million shares were traded that day. The day was known as Black Thursday. 5 days later, on Black Tuesday, some 16 million shares were traded after another wave of panic swept Wall Street. Millions of shares ended up worthless, and those investors who had bought stocks on margin, that is, with borrowed money, were wiped out completely. As consumer confidence vanished in the wake of the stock market crash, the downturn in spending and investment led factories and other businesses to slow down production and construction and begin firing their workers. For those who were lucky enough to remain employed, wages fell and buying power decreased. Many Americans, forced to buy on credit, fell into debt, and the number of foreclosures and repossessions climbed steadily. The adherence to the gold standard, which joined countries around the world in a fixed currency exchange, helped spread the depression from the United States throughout the world, especially in Europe. The Great Depression deepens, bank runs, and the Hoover administration. More so now, even, than in the time of the Great Depression, the world is interlinked, with one country and one banking system being dependent upon the next country and the next banking system. So today, a Great Depression could not just start just from the United States and spread throughout the world, but China could actually start a Great Depression that was spread throughout the world. America could start a Great Depression that was spread throughout the world, or Europe could start a Great Depression that was spread throughout the world. And most likely this new Great Depression would take a different form than the Great Depression before. The Great Depression before was a deflationary event. And the reason why is because of the relationship gold had back in those days to the dollar. That relationship now has been severed. Now we have a dollar that is correlated to oil. And all of the other currencies are correlated to the dollar. So this is a totally different game changer. So this time around, it would probably be an inflationary depression. Okay, let's move on. Despite assurances from President Herbert Hoover and other leaders that the crisis would run its course, matters continued to get worse over the next 3 years. By 1930, 4 million Americans were looking for work, and they could not find it. That number had risen to 6 million by 1931. Meanwhile, the country's industrial production had dropped by half. Bread lines, soup kitchens, and rising numbers of homeless people became more and more common in America's towns and cities. Farmers who had been struggling with their own economic depression for much of the 1920s due to drought and falling food prices could not afford to harvest their crops, and they were forced to leave them rotting in the fields while people elsewhere starved. In the fall of 1930, the first of 4 waves of banking panics began, as large numbers of investors lost confidence in the solvency of their banks and demanded deposits in cash, forcing banks to liquidate loans in order to supplement their insufficient cash reserves. Bank runs swept the American United States again in the spring and fall of 1931, and in the fall of 1932, and by early 1933, thousands of banks had closed their doors. In the face of this dire situation, Hoover administration tried supporting failing banks and other institutions with government loans. The idea was that the banks in turn would loan to businesses which would be able to hire back their employees. FDR addresses the Great Depression with the New Deal. This should be a lesson to us today, that the banks are not to be trusted. One of the things is the Federal Deposit Insurance Commission. A lot of people trust the banks because they believe that the bank has their back, has you covered because of the Federal Deposit Insurance Commission, where in fact the Federal Deposit Insurance Commission would have little of your money if the banks actually go into a bank holiday. Probably they would have less than 1 penny on the dollar. And they've also written it into law that the big shots, the 1%, is going to get that money first from the Federal Deposit Insurance Commission before all the little guys. And so they're going to eat that money up first. So do not trust the banks. The banks are ready to mess everybody up just like they were back when they messed everybody up back then. The banks are using a technique. That's why they call themselves savings and loan and trust. They want your trust. They've built this trust up since the Great Depression. Back then, nobody trusted the banks. They all knew better. The banks have slowly built this trust up over the last 80 or so years. And now all the people out there still trust the banks. You're going to learn the lesson the hard way. So let's move on. Hoover, a Republican who had formerly served as U.S. Secretary of Commerce, believed that governments should not directly intervene in the economy, and it did not have the responsibility to create jobs or provide economic relief for its citizens. In 1932, however, with the country mired in the depths of the Great Depression, and some 13 through 15 million people, or more than 20% of the U.S. population at that time unemployed, Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt won an overwhelming victory in the presidential election. By Inauguration Day, March 4th, 1933, every U.S. state had ordered all remaining banks to close at the end of the fourth wave of banking panics. And the U.S. Treasury did not have enough money to pay all the government workers. Nonetheless, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as he was known, projected a calm energy and optimism, famously declaring that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Roosevelt took immediate action to address the country's economic woes, first announcing a 4-day bank holiday, during which all banks would close so that Congress could pass reform legislation and reopen those banks determined to be sound. He also began addressing the public directly over the radio in a series of talks, and these so-called fireside chats went a long way toward restoring public confidence. During Roosevelt's first 100 days in office, his administration passed legislation that aimed to stabilize industrial and agricultural production, also to create jobs and to stimulate the recovery. In addition, Roosevelt sought to reform the financial system, creating the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, to protect depositors' accounts, and Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, to regulate the stock market and prevent abuses of the kind that led to the crash in 1929. The Great Depression, hard road to recovery. Among the programs and institutions of the New Deal that aided in recovery from the Great Depression were the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, which built dams and hydroelectric projects to control flooding and to provide electrical power to the impoverished Tennessee Valley region of the South, and the Works Project Administration, the WPA, a permanent jobs program that employed 8.5 million people from 1935 till 1943. After showing early signs of recovery beginning in the spring of 1933, the economy continued to improve throughout the next 3 years, during which real GDP, adjusted for inflation, grew at an average of 9% per year. Then, a sharp recession hit in 1937, caused in part by the Federal Reserve's decision to increase its requirements for money in the reserve. Though the economy began improving again in 1938, this second severe contraction reversed many of the gains in production and employment, and prolonged the effects of the Great Depression through the end of the decade. Depression-era hardships had fueled the rise of extremist political movements in various European countries, most notably that of Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime in Germany. German aggression led war to break out in Europe in 1939, and the WPA turned its attention towards strengthening the military infrastructure of the United States, even as the country maintained its neutrality. With Roosevelt's decision to support Britain and France in the struggle against Germany and the other Axis powers, defense manufacturing geared up, producing more and more private sector jobs. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941 led to an American declaration of war, and the nation's factories went back into full production mode. This expanding industrial production, as well as widespread conscription, began in 1942. It began reducing the employment rate to below its pre-Depression levels. When the Great Depression began, the United States was only an industrialized country in the world without some form of unemployment insurance or Social Security. In 1935, Congress passed the Social Security Act, which for the first time provided Americans with unemployment, disability, and pensions for old age.